Chapter 1. Overture. The Last Performance. Sandbourne-on-Sea in August is the kind of seaside town that has understood, over a long period of quiet confidence, that it does not need to compete with Bournemouth or Brighton. It is the right size, its esplanade is the right length, sufficient for a proper morning walk, but not so long as to become a commitment. Its pier is modest but well maintained, and its pier pavilion, a building of white-painted timber, with good acoustics, and windows that let in the smell of the sea during the interval, hosts a concert orchestra from June through September, and the Wednesday evening concerts are attended by people who have come to Sandbourne for the sea air, and found, not entirely to their surprise, that the music was worth coming for on its own terms. This is how Leonard Ashby liked to frame it in his program notes. He had a gift for the modest self-deprecating claim that was in fact immodestly self-promoting, and he had employed it consistently for 14 seasons. The town itself had a pleasant, unhurried rhythm that appealed to elderly visitors of settled habits. There were 3 respectable hotels along the cliff top, a row of Victorian boarding houses with immaculate brass door knockers, and a palm court tea room near the bandstand, where a trio played light selections every afternoon at 4. Miss Marple had come to Sandbourne at the invitation of her old friend, Mrs. Clara Beach, a retired schoolmistress of 67, who held a season ticket to the Pier Pavilion Orchestra with the unwavering fidelity of someone who regards this as a civic duty only slightly less important than voting. She had known Mrs. Beach since before the war, when they had been neighbors for 3 years in a village in Wiltshire, and she had maintained the friendship through a regular correspondence that covered, in roughly equal measure, the state of the nation, the state of Mrs. Beach's garden, and the state of the Sandbourne Orchestra's string section, about which Mrs. Beach had developed, over 12 seasons, opinions of great specificity. Beach lived in a small stone-built cottage on the upper lane, with a garden that sloped toward the sea, and a parlor filled with framed watercolors of the Dorset coast. She was a woman of precise habits and formidable local knowledge, who knew not only which boarding houses served fresh fish, but which musicians in the Pavilion Orchestra were on speaking terms, and which had not exchanged a word outside rehearsals since 1948. "This is his masterpiece," Mrs. Beach said, in the particular carrying whisper of a woman who is slightly deaf in one ear, and compensates with considerable force in the other. She tapped the program. The Harbour Suite. He wrote it during the war, 1942 it would have been. Said the sea was the only thing that kept him sane. They recorded it for Decca last spring. I bought the record the day it came out. She settled comfortably in her seat. The harbor theme opens it. 6 bars, and then the whole thing builds from there. You'll hear it in a moment. It has a quality, I've never been quite able to describe it, like something you've known before, and half forgotten. Watch when he brings it in. The hall was 3/4 full on a warm Wednesday evening, in late August. The pier's exterior electric bulbs glowed like a necklace of yellow pearls against the dusk, and through the pavilion's tall arched windows, the sea was visible as a vast dark expanse, running a gentle swell under the moon. The crisp smell of ozone and salt came in whenever the double doors at the rear opened to admit late arrivals. The orchestra filed in with the purposeful ease of musicians who know the stage. 14 strings in their sections, 7 winds, 3 brass, 2 percussion. The concertmaster, a lean, precise man named Edmund Trice, took his seat and played the A. The orchestra found it around him, and the hall filled with the particular beautiful disorder of an ensemble tuning, which resolved, after the customary minute, into silence. Leonard Ashby came on to what the program called sustained applause, and what it in fact was, the genuine warm reception of an audience greeting someone they have chosen to believe in, which is a different thing from mere politeness, and is recognizable by its quality of investment. He was dressed in impeccably tailored evening dress, with a white carnation in his lapel. He was a tall man who had carried his 58 years well, broad in the shoulder, slightly heavy in the face now, but carrying it with the polished ease of someone who has never had cause to worry about his appearance, because other people's admiration has always been forthcoming without effort. He bowed to the house, smiled warmly at the front rows, and then turned to the orchestra. And something in his manner changed as he turned, became less public and more specific, and he raised the baton. The harbor theme opened. 6 bars of D minor, a melody with a slightly uneven internal rhythm, a flattened 7th in the 5th bar that gave it a quality. Mrs. Beach was right that it was difficult to describe, of something in the process of being recalled, pulled up from memory imperfectly, not quite arriving at resolution before it began again. It was the kind of tune that seemed to belong to the listener, in some indefinite way, the kind that feels known without being identifiable. Miss Marple sat with her program in her lap, and listened to it with a degree of attention she had not planned. In the third chair of the second violins, a woman of 43 with good posture and a composed, slightly inward expression was playing the 6 bars she had composed 22 years ago and had played in this hall, under this conductor's baton, for 11 seasons. Her name was Constance Vane. She held her violin with the natural ease of someone for whom the instrument has been a physical extension of thought since childhood. And she listened to the harbor theme, the way a person listens to their own voice on a recording, at once completely familiar and subtly dislocated, exactly as one remembers it, and somehow not quite the same when external, when produced by other hands. She had been 25 when the arrangement began. She had graduated from the Royal College of Music 2 years earlier, with the best compositional portfolio her year had produced, and had found, as gifted young composers frequently do, that the world of professional music was not particularly interested in providing her with an income in exchange for composing. She had been working as a violin teacher in Taunton when she received an approach from Leonard Ashby, who had heard a short piano piece she had submitted for a regional competition, and had written to ask whether she would be interested in a professional arrangement of mutual benefit. The arrangement he described was this: she would compose, he would conduct. The work would appear under his name. She would receive a private weekly stipend. He framed it as an interim measure, a practical solution to the awkward fact that an unknown composer's work had limited commercial appeal, while a celebrated conductor's was in consistent demand. He suggested that once she was established in other ways, the arrangement could be reviewed. She had agreed. She was 25 and needed the income and the creative outlet, and the conditions of the arrangement had seemed, not ideal certainly, but temporary, a bridge between where she was and where she intended to be. The bridge had lasted 11 years, and the review had never come. What had changed in those 11 years was partly practical and partly something harder to name. The practical change: her income had become entirely dependent on the stipend, because composing under her own name had fallen away. She had not published her own work, had not built a reputation under her own name, had not built the connections and the career history that would allow her to survive without Ashby's arrangement. The harder-to-name change: the work had become more personal. The early compositions had been technically accomplished exercises in a style she had developed for the arrangement. The later ones, the Esplanade Suite, the winter concert pieces, and finally the Harbour Suite itself, had drawn from something deeper, from memory, from the specific geography of her own life, from her father on the Cornish quay. When you put your most private self into work that is then performed as someone else's most private self, there is a particular quality of loss that has no clean name. She had lived with it for 11 years. She had, in the way that people accommodate the conditions of their lives, made a kind of peace with it, the peace of a person who has stopped pushing against something immovable, and has redirected their energy inward. And then the Decca record had arrived in the post. The first half of the program lasted 52 minutes. At the 52nd minute, during the second movement of the Harbour Suite, Maestro Leonard Ashby stumbled on the podium. Edmund Trice, watching from the concertmaster's seat, saw it as a small thing at first, a slight forward lean, the kind of momentary unsteadiness attributable to the heat of the hall, or a moment of physical fatigue in a man who had been on his feet for nearly an hour, conducting with full physical commitment. Then Ashby's baton arm dropped. Then his knees gave out with the unhurried certainty of something structural failing, not a dramatic collapse, but a subsiding, as though the system had reached a threshold, and having reached it, simply stopped. And he was on the stage floor before anyone in the orchestra had risen from their seat. The hall went very quiet. The quality of the silence was different from concert silence. Concert silence is attentive, forward-leaning, filled with listening. This was the silence of 300 people who had just seen something happen that contradicted their expectations of the evening, and who were processing the contradiction before deciding what to do about it. Miss Marple in row D noted several things rapidly. Edmund Trice moved fastest, on his feet and at the podium in 3 seconds, kneeling beside Ashby with the practical competence of someone who knows what to do when a person falls. 2 of the Winds stood and looked at each other in the way of people who need someone else to make a decision before they can. The percussionist at the back went immediately to the telephone in the wings, which was the most useful thing anyone in the orchestra did in the first 30 seconds. Then the hall broke into noise. She noted the way Constance Vane responded. Constance set her violin on her chair, the bow placed carefully across it, not dropped, and sat with her hands in her lap and watched the podium. She did not move toward Ashby. She did not look at her colleagues for guidance. She sat very still, in the posture of a person who is waiting for something to happen, with the particular quality of waiting that comes from knowing what is going to happen rather than fearing it. Her face was not the face of someone surprised. Chapter 2. First Movement. 40 Pairs of Hands. The Sandbourne Pier Pavilion's backstage area occupied the lower level beneath the stage. A series of connected rooms, dressing rooms, a small green room, a prop store, the stage manager's office, reached by a wooden staircase from the stage right wing. In the normal course of a Wednesday evening concert, the conductor's podium was set by the stage manager's team. Music stand, baton case, water carafe, the specific items in the specific positions that Leonard Ashby had preferred for 14 seasons. In practice, however, the actual physical task of laying out the podium had long since been delegated to Constance Vane. She had taken it on in her second season, when the stage manager at the time had been dealing with a difficult horn section and had been grateful for the offer. And it had simply continued from that point onward, with the momentum that small, useful arrangements acquire when no one has any particular reason to change them. No one had asked her to lay out the podium on Wednesday evening. She had simply done it, as she had done it for 10 years. And the stage manager had been grateful for the time saved, and no one had paid particular attention to when she had done it or how long it had taken. Miss Marple found Edmund Trice at the pavilion on Thursday morning, in one of the small practice rooms at the back. A narrow room with a window overlooking the car park, and a music stand set up in the corner, where he was working through the fingering of something that sounded like Elgar. He was a lean, methodical man, whose manner communicated the particular kind of seriousness that comes from having spent a great many hours alone with a difficult instrument. A seriousness directed inward rather than outward, with no particular interest in the impression it made. He was, Miss Marple judged, entirely reliable. He reported what he had seen without addition or interpretation, and he did not attempt to guess at what it meant. "She was here before most of us on Wednesday," he said. "I arrived at about 6:30. Coming down from the stage, I saw her at the bottom of the staircase from the stage right wing. She had her instrument case." "Was she carrying anything else?" A brief pause. Not the pause of someone inventing an answer, the pause of someone who had seen something and was now being asked to recall it precisely. "A cloth parcel, wrapped loosely, about the size of a pair of gloves, I suppose. She had it under her arm, against her side." He looked at his bow. "I didn't think anything of it at the time. Musicians carry things." Miss Marple thanked him and went to find George Pollitt. The musicians of the Pier Pavilion Orchestra were, taken individually, a community of the kind that forms in any institution where the same people do the same work in the same building over a long period. A community of accumulated knowledge and mutual adjustment, where every person has long since filed away the characteristics of every other and ceased to consider them remarkable. They knew each other's habits the way one knows the sounds of a familiar house at night, not by attention, but by the absence of noticing, which is a different, and in some ways more complete form of knowledge. The first oboist, a retired teacher named Agnes Merritt, always arrived precisely 40 minutes before curtain, and spent 25 of them warming up scales in the same order. The second clarinet, a young man named Robert Frame, forgot his reed case approximately once every 3 weeks, and borrowed from the first clarinet, who kept a spare specifically for this purpose, and had stopped mentioning it. The bass clarinet sat near the side window, because he needed to see the weather. He was persuaded, after some difficulty, that the concert hall's acoustics were not materially affected by the condition of the sky outside. One of the cellists read detective novels in the interval. The second trumpeter had won a regional competition in 1948, and the certificate was on his dressing-room shelf. He had declined 3 separate requests to remove it from the wall and replace it with the season's program board, and the stage manager had eventually given up. They had noticed things about Constance Vane, too, over 11 years. They had simply stopped considering those observations significant. They would reconsider now. Miss Marple spoke with several of them over the course of Thursday and Friday. The conversations had the quality of conversations with people who are cooperating fully, and remembering things they had ceased to think of as memories, had ceased to think of as anything really, had simply filed under the category of how things are, which is the largest and least examined category in most people's mental filing systems. Agnes Merritt, the first oboist, had sat next to Constance in the interval once, 2 seasons ago, when the usual seating arrangements in the green room were disrupted by a rehearsal running long. They had talked, briefly, about the Harbour Suite, which had been on the upcoming program. Merritt had said something about how she found the harbour theme particularly striking, more so than the usual pavilion repertoire, and had asked Ashby where he'd found it, whether it was based on something he'd heard, some actual melody. Ashby had said it came from his childhood memory of the sea at Worthing. Constance had said nothing. Merritt had noticed that she said nothing, and had attributed it to the reserve that Constance generally maintained in conversations that touched on Ashby's work. She had not thought further about it. She thought further about it now. Robert Frame, the second clarinet, had shared a rehearsal room with Constance on 3 occasions, and had heard her working through something on the violin that was not in the season's program. On one occasion he had asked what it was. She had said it was a personal exercise, and he had accepted this because musicians do have personal exercises. He could not now remember the melodic line. He thought, if pressed, that it might have been in a minor key. He was not pressed. It was not the most specific evidence. The most useful conversation, as it turned out, was with a musician Miss Marple had not originally planned to speak with, Marion Cole, who played 4th cello and had been in the orchestra for 3 seasons, and who had, on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 months before the concert, encountered Constance Vane in the car park after a rehearsal, and walked with her to the bus stop on the Esplanade. During this walk, Constance had said something that Marion Cole had not understood at the time, and had not thought about since. She had said, apparently in connection with nothing in particular, unprompted, in the way that people occasionally say something that has been accumulating unsaid for a long time, and has finally reached the point of surface pressure, that there was a kind of arrangement one could enter into that seemed workable at the start, and became by degrees something one could no longer see around. I assume she was talking about a personal relationship, Marion said. She'd been living alone for as long as I'd known her. I thought she was talking about, I don't know, a friendship that had gone wrong, or something of that kind. She didn't say anything further, and I didn't ask. She looked at her hands. I should have asked. People rarely ask, Miss Marple said, with the mild, absolute kindness of someone who is not absolving, but is also not adding to the weight. It's very easy not to ask. The asking seems intrusive until afterward, when it seems important. Marian Cole thanked her, which was an unexpected response to a murder inquiry, and went back to her cello case. Miss Marple walked back to the hotel along the esplanade, past the bus stop where the conversation had happened, and thought about what Constance had said, a reality one could no longer circumvent. A characterization of an arrangement that had been, at its beginning, a practical solution to a practical problem, and had become, by 11 years of increment, the complete horizon of a professional life. The thing about horizons is that you don't notice you can't see beyond them until you try to look. Chapter 3. Second Movement. A Man Falls. Leonard Ashby died at Sandbourne Cottage Hospital at 9:30 on Wednesday evening, approximately 2 hours after his collapse. The attending physician, a Dr. Rawlings, who had the pavilion on his regular evening call since the incident in 1949, when a guest conductor had fainted from dehydration, had diagnosed cardiac arrest within 10 minutes of examination. The basis for this diagnosis was sound on its face. Ashby had a documented history of cardiac irregularity, had been under the treatment of a London cardiologist since 1951, and had been advised on multiple occasions to reduce the physical intensity of his conducting commitments, advice he had not taken. The symptoms were consistent. The age and history were consistent. The diagnosis was, given the information available to Dr. Rawlings on Wednesday evening, professionally defensible. It was not correct. The backstage area of the pavilion, in the period between Ashby's collapse and the arrival of the ambulance, had the quality of a space that has been organized around one purpose and suddenly has to accommodate another entirely. Musicians who had been performing were now standing in corridors with their instruments. The stage manager was on the telephone. The 2 percussionists had moved the podium clear. 3 audience members had somehow found their way backstage and were being gently redirected by a baffled front-of-house assistant. Miss Marple moved through all of this with the quiet purposefulness that she had found, over many years, to be the most effective navigation tool in a crisis. Unhurried, not obviously purposeful, giving the impression of belonging rather than investigating. She had found that people in a state of crisis tend not to question the presence of someone who appears to be precisely where they expect themselves to be, particularly when that person is elderly and carries a knitting bag and looks as though they have been asked to come and sit quietly by someone of authority. No one had asked her to come and sit quietly, but the effect was the same. The backstage corridor smelled of old timber and instrument rosin, and very faintly, something else, a chemical undertone that she noticed briefly and filed away. It was not a smell that belonged in a concert hall. It was the kind of smell one encounters in specific technical contexts, and the specific technical context in which she had encountered it before was relevant to what she was thinking about. She was following Inspector Godwin toward the dressing-room area when she heard it. Someone humming. Not loudly, barely audible above the general noise of the backstage aftermath, but clearly, and with the unconscious absorption of a person for whom the music is so internal that it surfaces in moments of distraction, without any conscious decision. 6 bars of D minor, the Harbour theme, exactly as she had heard it from the orchestra 20 minutes before. She turned. The corridor was empty. A door to her left was just swinging shut. She noted it and said nothing, and continued after Godwin. Inspector Godwin of Sandbourne CID arrived at the pavilion at 9:15. He was a solid, careful man of 52, who had the policeman's useful quality of moving faster than he appeared to. He collected statements from the orchestra with systematic thoroughness, working from the podium outward. Trice first, then the flanking violins, then the winds who had the clearest sightlines. He noted the stage manager's account of the pre-concert routine. He asked about the Baton case's location with the general interest of someone accounting for all the objects on a stage, not the specific interest of someone who suspects any of them. He did not, on Wednesday evening, have reason to think differently. He identified it as an unexplained sudden death, and treated it with the completeness that implied, preserve the scene, collect information, wait for the morning. The morning brought Miss Marple, who had spent the night thinking about a chemical undertone and a 6-bar theme, and a woman who had not been surprised. Chapter 4. Third Movement. The Baton. Godwin received her in the pavilion manager's small office, a room crowded with filing cabinets and season programs going back 20 years, and a desk buried under the administrative correspondence of a busy summer season. He had the manner of a man who has been up since 6 and had already had 3 conversations he hadn't expected, and he received a 4th with the composure of someone accustomed to the unexpected as a professional baseline. He listened to Miss Marple without interruption, which she appreciated. She said, "The timing of Ashby's collapse was notable, 52 minutes into a performance during which he had handled only one object consistently, and with sustained pressure." She said, "The chemical undertone in the corridor was consistent with a class of alkaloid compounds she had encountered once before, in an entirely different connection." She said, "Cork is a porous material that absorbs solutions applied to its surface and releases them slowly under sustained pressure and warmth, precisely the conditions created by a conductor's grip on a baton handle during a full performance." She said she might be entirely wrong. Godwin said, "The baton is on the podium." He stood up. They went together to the stage, which had not been fully cleared, and Godwin examined the baton with the careful attention of a man who has not been given a reason to look at a baton before, and is now looking at one as though it might explain something. He placed it in a cloth envelope and wrote a note for the county laboratory. He sent it by car that afternoon. Those 4 days were not idle ones. Godwin was methodical in the way that good investigators are methodical. He followed each thread to its end before picking up the next one, and he was not distracted by the elegance of any particular explanation from the obligation to check the alternatives. He interviewed Constance Vane twice during those 4 days. Once on Thursday, when he was gathering general information from all the orchestra members, and once on Saturday, when he had begun to focus. Both interviews were inconclusive in the formal sense. She answered everything asked of her, and gave him nothing further. He noted, without being certain what to make of it, that her answers had a quality of preparation about them that was not quite natural, but was not quite artificial enough to point clearly in a single direction. Miss Marple, who heard his accounts of the interviews, noted the same quality, and was certain what it meant. She said nothing about this to Godwin yet, because certainty about what something means is not the same as evidence that a court would find useful, and she had learned over many years that the former is worthless without the latter. The 4 days between the submission and the laboratory's response were, for Godwin, occupied with the obvious lines of investigation: the musicians, the pavilion management, the guest who had been present with a documented motive. For Miss Marple, they were occupied partly with these lines, and partly with something she could not yet articulate fully, but which was taking shape at the edge of her attention, connected to 11 years and a 6-bar melody, and a woman who laid out the conductor's podium as though it were a duty too familiar to require conscious thought. The laboratory's report arrived on Sunday. Aconitine, a concentrated solution, absorbed through sustained skin contact over approximately 40 to 50 minutes of uninterrupted handling. Godwin read the report at his desk in the Sandbourne police station, and then walked to the Anchor guest house and found Miss Marple in the garden, and told her. "Yes," she said, "I thought it was likely something of that kind." She considered for a moment. The access question is the most important one. Who laid out the podium, and when, and was anyone else in a position to have done the same thing at any point in the preceding hours? Constance Vane, Godwin said. She's been doing it for 11 years, Miss Marple said, which would make it very easy, and which would also, I think, make it worth asking what else she has been doing for 11 years. Godwin looked at her. She was knitting quietly, with the expression of someone who has said exactly as much as she intended to say, and is now waiting to see if the other person would like to know more. Go on, he said. Let's investigate the other possibilities first. It would be embarrassing to have missed something obvious. She passed him the tea. Chapter 5. Fourth Movement. Jealousy in D minor. Philip Marsh arrived in Sandbourne on Thursday morning by the 11:15 train from Eastbourne, and he arrived with the bearing of a man who has arranged his public manner around the expectation that other people will watch him, and has been doing so for long enough that the arrangement has become permanent. He was 51, tall, and had the particular air of competitive men who have achieved a great deal and found it insufficient. Not because what they achieved was small, but because there was always someone else who had achieved it more visibly. He and Leonard Ashby had been conducting a professional disagreement for the better part of a decade, and their disagreement had the specific quality of disputes between people whose fields are both narrow enough to produce direct competition and prestigious enough for the competition to matter. The BBC Coastal Broadcast Commission was the most recent point of contention. It had gone to Sandbourne for the 1952 summer season over Eastbourne, and Marsh had not forgiven either the BBC or Ashby for this in the intervening year. His response in the Musical Times, a letter of careful, measured, devastating critical precision, had been sufficiently well phrased to be quoted approvingly even by people who thought he was wrong about the facts. He had been at the pavilion on Wednesday evening as the guest of the manager, Ronald Hicks, who had extended the invitation in what he described as a collegial spirit, and what several people who knew both men regarded as the managerial equivalent of inviting a predator to the pasture in the hope that the sight of the fence would reassure everyone. Marsh had attended. He had sat in the reserved section. He had watched the performance with the attentiveness of a professional watching a colleague's work, which is the most uncharitable attentiveness available. Inspector Godwin spoke with him on Thursday afternoon in the manager's office, and the interview was productive in the negative way that good investigations require. It closed a door completely, which is as useful as opening one. Marsh's account of his Wednesday evening was straightforward and multiply confirmed. He had arrived at the pavilion at 7:15. The bar manager, Stanley Horder, 22 years behind the same bar, with the phenomenal memory for faces and orders common to people in that profession, had served him 2 brandies over the following 75 minutes, and confirmed that Marsh had not left the bar area for any significant period. The bar was on the opposite side of the building from the stage right wing and the staircase to the dressing rooms. More critically, the Baton preparation had taken place at 6:15, according to the stage manager's clipboard records. Marsh had arrived at 7:15. The hour-long gap between preparation and his arrival eliminated him entirely. He had not had access to the podium. He had not been near the dressing rooms. He had been in a bar drinking brandy and talking about the London orchestral season, to people who were, by the account of most of them, less interested than he appeared to assume. Godwin cleared him by Thursday evening with a completeness that left no residual interest. Miss Marple had done so in her own mind on Thursday morning, for the same reasons, and had moved on to considering the others. She also, in the course of the same Thursday, spent an hour in conversation with Edmund Trice about the musical life of the Sandbourne Orchestra more generally, not about the murder, or not obviously about it, but about the working dynamics of the ensemble, the history of the major compositions, the relationship between the conductor and the musicians over 14 seasons. Trice spoke with the care of a man who is choosing his words, but he was congenitally truthful, and the choosing was audible. He confirmed what she had begun to suppose, that Ashby's compositional output had been, since his appointment at Sandbourne, unusually consistent for a man with the administrative and performance demands of a full-time conducting position. That the scores, when distributed for rehearsal, arrived already fully formed, not as working documents with corrections and revisions, but as clean, finished manuscripts. That Ashby, when asked technical compositional questions by the orchestra members during rehearsal, would occasionally refer to notes he kept separately, rather than answering from immediate knowledge, which was unusual in a composer discussing their own work. I told myself it was simply his working method. Some composers are more systematic than others. He paused. I told myself a number of things over the years. Miss Marple thanked him pleasantly, and did not suggest what she thought he had known and chosen not to examine. Chapter 6. Fifth Movement. The Manager's Ledger. Ronald Hicks was 44, and had managed the Sandbourne Pier Pavilion for 6 years with the anxious efficiency of a man who is doing a job slightly beyond his natural confidence, but compensating for it with very long hours and a great many filed documents. He was not, at first inspection, someone who inspired particular suspicion. He had a brisk, cooperative manner with the police, and answered Godwin's initial questions with a readiness that seemed, on the surface, like helpful transparency. The readiness concealed a specific fear, which Miss Marple had identified by the second interview. She had described it to Godwin as the fear of a man who is worried the current upheaval will illuminate a separate matter he has been managing quietly on his own, which is a different and recognizably distinct quality from the fear of someone who has committed the crime under investigation. Among Leonard Ashby's papers, found in a search of his rooms at the Sandbourne Arms Hotel, was a memorandum addressed to the Pavilion Board. It was dated 3 weeks prior to the concert. It described with careful specificity a pattern of box office receipt discrepancies that had persisted over 26 months and amounted to a shortage of approximately £30 per month. The memorandum named Ronald Hicks. It was, in its calm precision, the kind of document that a man in Hicks's position would find it very difficult to survive professionally. Godwin interviewed Hicks on Friday morning, and the interview had the quality of a long-anticipated conversation finally arriving. Hicks did not deny the embezzlement. He admitted it with the quiet relief of someone who has been carrying a secret for 2 years and finds the carrying worse than the consequence. He said that Ashby had made clear, in a recent conversation, that he was aware of the discrepancy, and said so with a mildness that was more threatening than anger. The mildness of a man who has the document in his desk and knows he has it. Hicks had therefore been frightened of Ashby. He had motive, in the formal sense of the word. His movements on Wednesday evening were the best accounted for of anyone at the pavilion that night. He had been at the reception desk from 6 o'clock until the concert began at 7:30, greeting guests, managing the door arrangement, addressing a small disagreement about reserved seating, and being visible to 4 members of the front-of-house staff throughout. He had not been near the stage. He had not been near the staircase. He had been completely isolated from the conductor's stand. Miss Marple explained to Godwin on Friday afternoon the distinction she had identified in Hicks's fear. He wanted Ashby unable to pursue the matter, she said, but the most straightforward way to achieve that would have been to get ahead of it. Confess to the board first, offer restitution, manage the narrative. Murder is a very extreme response to a financial irregularity that a clever man could survive by other means. Mr. Hicks is not brave, but he is clever. He would not have taken the more extreme path when the less extreme one was available. She paused. He is also, I think, genuinely distressed about Ashby's death, which a man who had caused it would be managing more carefully. The embezzlement was referred to the Pavilion Board as a separate matter. Hicks was charged in due course, but that is a different story, and a shorter one. Chapter 7. Sixth Movement. The Soprano's Secret. Marion Chain had a voice of the kind that Sandbourne did not produce locally. A trained lyric soprano, clear and precise, with the particular focused quality of someone who has spent a long time making a difficult instrument exact. She was 38, had studied at the Guildhall, and had been engaged for a guest performance in the pavilion's summer season by Leonard Ashby, who had also, the previous year, ended a 14-month personal relationship with her by the simple mechanism of not renewing the engagement. A method of termination that told her she was valued precisely as much as her usefulness, and not more. She had come to the concert on Wednesday as a paying audience member, which required a certain quality of equanimity on her part, and she had managed it, because Marian Chain's professional life had required her to develop a high tolerance for situations that were personally uncomfortable. She had gone backstage before the performance. 2 stage crew confirmed seeing her in the corridor at approximately 6:45. She had spoken to Ashby. One crew member described the conversation as heated. The other described Ashby's manner afterward as dismissive, and suggested this was his habitual response to things that were inconvenient. She had returned to her seat at 7:10 and had remained there. The baton had been prepared at 6:15. Marian Chain had arrived backstage at 6:45, 30 minutes after the preparation. Even if she had gone directly to the podium, and the stage manager's records showed that she had not been near the stage right wing, had gone directly to the dressing room corridor and back, she would have been too late. The court grip was already treated. Ashby's hands were already going to receive what was waiting for them. Godwin cleared her on Saturday, after an interview in which she had been candid about the backstage confrontation. She had said, she told him, precisely what she thought of how the relationship had ended and what it had cost her. And Ashby had responded with the condescension of a man who had never been required to consider the cost to other people of his own convenience. She had then returned to the audience and watched the concert. She was not pleased about having been suspected. She said so with a directness that made Godwin grateful for having cleared her promptly. Miss Marple had spoken briefly with Marian Chain in the hotel garden on the Friday, before Godwin's Saturday interview. The conversation had not been investigative in its framing. It had been the conversation of 2 women sitting in the same hotel at the same difficult juncture in the same event, which is a different kind of conversation, and sometimes more revealing. Marian had talked about what it was like to perform as a guest at the pavilion, the oddness of being invited to a place by someone who had ended a relationship with you, the particular social geometry of the professional world in which you cannot simply avoid the people who have treated you badly because you are likely to work with them again. She said that the music was worth the discomfort, and she said it with the conviction of someone who has thought this through carefully and is still uncertain whether it is true. Miss Marple had asked, with the mild interest of a woman asking about nothing in particular, whether Marian had noticed anything unusual about Wednesday evening's performance, apart from the obvious. Marian thought for a moment. She had noticed, she said, that Constance Vane had played the Harbour theme differently from how she usually played it. Not technically differently, the notes were the same, the tempo was the same, but with a quality she found difficult to name, something more concentrated than usual. Not the usual quality of a musician attending to a performance, but the quality of someone attending to a performance for the last time. She had not known what to make of it at the time. She thought perhaps it was the recording, that the existence of the Decca record had given the work a different weight for the players who had been performing it longest. She thought perhaps it was simply the particular acoustic of that evening's hall, which had been very good. Miss Marple thanked her, and did not say what she thought it was. There was no point in saying it then. Marian Chain's directness and her observation about the quality of Constance's playing were both entirely reasonable in the circumstances. The first confirmed what Godwin needed to know. The second confirmed what Miss Marple already knew. Chapter 8. 7th Movement. Recurring Theme. George Paulet had been chief usher at the Sandbourne Pier Pavilion for 22 years, and was the most deeply embedded observer of the building and its musicians that the investigation had access to. He was 60, carefully dressed, with the formal courtesy of someone who has spent decades managing the public experience of other people's events, and has developed opinions about how things ought to be done, that are, in his own estimation, rarely wrong. He was polishing the glass of the program display case in the foyer on Friday morning, when Miss Marple found him, and he received her questions with the considered seriousness of a man who takes requests for observation as a form of professional validation. She asked him about the musician's habits. He began with an inventory. Trice's 2-bar whistle after a good rehearsal. Frame's weekly reed crisis. The bass clarinet's weather watching. All delivered with the mild fondness of a long-tenure staff member cataloging the eccentricities he has learned to accommodate. Then he said, without being particularly prompted, "Miss Vane hums." "Does she?" Miss Marple said with mild interest. "Always the same thing, the harbor theme, the 6-bar piece that opens the suite. She does it when she's preoccupied, working something out, or worried about something. I've heard it 100 times over 11 years, at least. In the corridor after rehearsal, in the car park, in the interval." He paused. "Once I knocked on the dressing-room door for a message, and she was humming it inside, quite absorbed. Didn't hear me at first." He reflected for a moment. "It always struck me as curious, that tune in particular. You'd think if you were going to hum something without thinking about it, it would be something personal, a pop song, or something from your childhood. Not someone else's composition. But there it is." Not someone else's composition, Miss Marple thought. She thanked him, and walked out onto the pier. The pier in August morning light had a quieter quality than in the evening. The pavilion closed. The café shuttered until 10. The boards still slightly damp from the night sea air. She walked to the railing at the far end and stood looking at the water, which was gray-green and running a slight chop from the southwest, and thought. A woman who hummed the same 6 bars of music for 11 years, not occasionally, but habitually, reflexively, as a default response to stress and thought. The music she was humming was not someone else's composition. It was, Miss Marple was becoming certain, the most personally specific piece of music in a body of work attributed to a man who had no personal connection to the memory it encoded. She stood at the railing for a while, and let the logic of it assemble itself without interference. The 6-bar melody was the key. Not in the investigative sense, though it was that too, but in the structural sense, the foundational element from which everything else had been built. If a woman hummed a tune constantly, reflexively, without thinking, for 11 years, the tune was not a professional favorite or a concert hall earworm. It was something personal. And if the personal thing was the opening movement of a composition attributed to someone else, the attribution was wrong. Not wrong by accident, wrong by construction. By a construction that had required someone's active consent to something that was not, in the end, consented to in the way that the original parties had perhaps imagined. The tide was coming in. She watched it cover the lower planks of the pier structure, the quiet mechanical encroachment of water, and thought about what things are versus what things are called, which had been the central question of this particular business from the beginning. The other matter, Joey Barker, was disposed of more briefly. Barker was 26 and had been seen by 2 separate witnesses in the dressing-room corridor approximately 40 minutes before the concert, at a time when he had no scheduled business there. Godwin had noted the discrepancy. Pollitt had resolved it. Barker had been near the box office area, not the dressing rooms, approaching from the wrong direction to have come from the stage right wing. His proximity to the cash tin confirmed Hicks's embezzlement, but was irrelevant to the murder. Miss Marple noted it, filed it, and returned her attention to the matter that mattered. Chapter 9. 8th Movement. The Stagehand's Evidence. The laboratory report arrived by special post on Sunday morning, and Godwin brought it to the Anchor Guesthouse garden at 11 o'clock, and read it to Miss Marple while she knitted. Aconitine, confirmed. A concentrated solution, applied to the cork grip of Ashby's personal baton. Absorbed through sustained skin contact during approximately 40 to 50 minutes of normal conducting pressure, releasing steadily under the warmth of the hand. Consistent with symptoms observed. Onset of cardiac-adjacent effects after 45 to 50 minutes of exposure, progressing to collapse at 52 minutes from the start of the performance. He put the report on the garden table between them. The preparation, Miss Marple said. When was the podium laid out? Stage manager's clipboard says 6:15. Dennis Holt, he keeps excellent records. And when did the musicians begin arriving? 6:30 or so. Trice at 6:30. Most of the others between then and 7. So between 6:15 and 6:30, the podium area was accessible only to whoever was already in the building. She looked at her knitting. Edmund Trice saw Constance Vane at the bottom of the stage right staircase at 6:30, coming down, not going up. She had been on the stage, and she was coming down, and she was carrying a cloth parcel. Barker also saw the parcel, Godwin said. Yes, Miss Marple agreed softly. He described it as being roughly the proportions of dress gloves. She counted a stitch with the point of her needle. A small thing to carry in a coat pocket, but quite sufficient if applied with intention. Godwin went to the pavilion on Monday morning with a search warrant and the locksmith. In Constance Vane's instrument locker, a small steel cabinet with a combination lock, standard issue to all permanent orchestra members, was a cloth parcel. Inside the parcel, a pair of rubber kitchen gloves. On the inner surface of the finger lining, concentrated on the fingertips and palm areas, traces of aconitine. He went back to the garden to tell Miss Marple. She said that she thought it was time to speak with Constance Vane, but that she would like a moment first to explain what she believed the context was. Not the method, which was now clear, but the reason, which mattered if one wanted to understand what had actually happened here, as opposed to simply what could be proved. Godwin sat down and listened. What she told him, over the next quarter of an hour in the hotel garden, while the late-season wasps investigated the last of the afternoon tea, was this: that the Harbour Suite and the 11 years of compositions preceding it were not Ashby's work, that Constance Vane had composed them under a private arrangement, that the arrangement had begun as a practical measure, and had become, over time, a comprehensive suppression of one person's creative identity for the benefit of another person's reputation, that the Decca recording had been made and sold without Constance's knowledge or consent, and that the total commercial and reputational benefit accrued by Leonard Ashby from Constance Vane's work over 11 years was, in round figures, the difference between a celebrated conductor's career and an obscure orchestral arranger's. She said this calmly and in order, as she said most things. Godwin listened in the way he listened to useful information, attentively, without interruption, with the occasional note taken in his small, neat handwriting. At the end of it, he said, "It still doesn't give her the right." "No," Miss Marple said, "it doesn't. It gives her a reason. Those are different things." She picked up her knitting. "I thought you should have both before the interview." Chapter 10. Ninth Movement. What the Music Knows. The information that made the shape of the thing complete came from 3 separate directions over the course of the following week, and Miss Marple assembled it the way she assembled most things, by writing to the right people, asking the precise question, and waiting for the answers that the right questions produced. The Royal College of Music confirmed, through a retired professor named Hadley, who had maintained contact with former students and was glad to be useful, that Constance Vane had enrolled in 1929 and graduated in 1933 with distinction in violin, theory, and composition. Her graduation portfolio had been considered the most accomplished compositional work submitted in that year's cohort, a judgment the retired professor offered with the directness of someone who had formed the opinion at the time and found no reason to revise it subsequently. She had also, in her first and second years, completed a supplementary course in chemistry, not unusual for students with an interest in the acoustics and physics of musical instruments. The professor added, without being asked, that he had been surprised not to hear more of Constance Vane's compositional work in the years following her graduation. He had expected, he said, that she would have a significant career. He said it with the mild puzzlement of someone who has watched a talented person disappear into obscurity and has never quite understood why. Miss Marple understood why. The Decca Records information arrived through a music journalist in London who wrote for a trade publication and had the kind of access to commercial correspondence in the recording industry that comes from 20 years of careful relationship maintenance with the people who process it. The Harbour Suite, sold to Decca by Leonard Ashby alone, for an advance of £200, 3 months prior to the concert, had been submitted with a handwritten score bearing only Ashby's name. The contract was in his name. The advance had been paid to him. The recording, already in commercial circulation, on sale in music shops across the country, bore his name on the label in the usual way, with the year of composition listed as 1942. There was no mention of Constance Vane anywhere in the commercial chain. The journalist, who had been briefed only that there was a question about the provenance of the work, asked Miss Marple whether there was likely to be a story in it. She said she thought there might be, eventually, and that she would write to him when she knew more. She also mentioned, in passing, that the original handwritten score she was aware of was not in the handwriting of the named composer, and that there were witnesses who could confirm having seen it. The journalist wrote this down with the particular alertness of a professional registering a fact that is going to be very useful later. The third piece of information came from Edmund Trice, on Monday afternoon, in the small practice room at the back of the pavilion. She asked him directly, had he ever seen a score for the Harbour Suite before Ashby presented it to the orchestra for rehearsal? Trice was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at his music stand rather than at her. "I saw a draft," he said. 2 seasons ago, in Constance's practice room. She had left it on the stand, and I came in to return a fingering chart I'd borrowed. I saw the opening bars." He paused. The handwriting was not Ashby's. "I know his handwriting from our correspondence. It was not his." Another pause. The handwriting was consistent with the marginal notes Constance makes on her own rehearsal copies. "I am sufficiently familiar with both to say that." "Did you tell anyone?" "No." He looked at his bow. "I told myself I might have been mistaken. It was easier to tell myself that than to consider what it would mean if I wasn't." He said this with the flat, precise honesty of someone who has been sitting with a fact for 2 years and has finally put it into words, which is both a relief and a weight. Miss Marple thanked him and left him to continue sitting with it. There was something to be said about his choice, but this was not the moment for it, and she suspected he was already saying it to himself more effectively than she could. She understood, by Monday evening, the complete shape of 11 years. A young woman of exceptional compositional ability, entering an arrangement that had seemed at 25 like a bridge, and discovering at 43 that it had become the only road. A woman who had composed the music that filled the Pier Pavilion for 11 seasons, whose work had been broadcast on the BBC and recorded for Decca, and applauded by audiences who did not know her name, who had received a stipend that kept her dependent and a credit that kept her invisible, who had for 11 years played her own music back to herself in the third chair of the second violins, under another man's baton, with her father's tune in her hands. And then the gramophone record had come in the post. She sat with this for a while, in the evening at the window of the Anchor guest house. The pier was lit below. Chapter 11. 10th Movement. The Harbour Theme. The formal interview took place on Tuesday morning at the Sandbourne police station, in a room that had the functional austerity of spaces designed for difficult conversations. Constance Vane arrived on time and sat down with the composed, attentive manner of someone who is prepared carefully and intends to be correct in every response. She was. Godwin's questions were thorough, and her answers were technically accurate. She confirmed that she had laid out the podium, as she always did. She confirmed that she had carried her instrument case. She said she did not recall the cloth parcel that Trice and Barker had described, or gave answers about it that were accurate without being informative. She was, Miss Marple thought, watching from her chair in the corner, a woman who had thought very carefully about how to respond to this kind of questioning, and had arrived at a set of answers that would not be immediately useful. The composure was very good. It had been constructed under sustained pressure over a long time, and had become nearly automatic. The interview ran for 40 minutes. At some point during the middle section, when Godwin was asking about her relationship with the pavilion management, and she was giving a careful, measured answer, she began to hum. It was not a conscious act. It was barely perceptible, a sound below the threshold of deliberate vocalization, the kind of thing a person does when their surface attention is occupied with a controlled response, and the deeper part of their mind is working very hard at something that it cannot fully suppress. 6 bars of D minor. The harbor theme. Inspector Godwin was looking at his notes. He did not notice. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her corner, noticed everything. She filed it and said nothing. After the formal interview, Godwin stepped out to telephone his sergeant, and Miss Marple remained in her chair, and Constance Vane looked at the window and the pale late August sky beyond it, and the room was quiet. "Have you ever been to Porthleven?" Miss Marple said. Her voice was quiet and conversational, as though she were asking about a holiday destination. The quality of the stillness was complete. Not the measured stillness of her interview composure, but the absolute stillness of a person who has just heard the word that unlocks something they have been holding shut. "My father was a fisherman," she said. She said it after a moment, in a voice that had lost the careful control of the interview, and was simply her voice. "He was from Porthleven. He hummed that melody every morning when he went down to the boats, before light. I don't know if he made it up, or if his father gave it to him. I wrote it down when I was 9 years old so I wouldn't forget it, and when I was at college I built the suite around it, because it was the truest thing I had." She stopped. Her hands were on the table. "He performed it for 11 years, and told every audience it was his memory of the Sussex coast. He had never been to Cornwall. He didn't know what that melody meant." Miss Marple said, "No, he couldn't have." Inspector Godwin came back in. Miss Marple stood, picked up her bag, and said very quietly that she thought she and the inspector ought to have a brief conversation before anyone left. Chapter 12. 11th Movement. What Cannot Be Unknown. The conversation was not technically a formal interview. It took place in the same room, with Godwin present throughout, but it had a different quality. Not the procedural quality of question and response, but the quality of a thing being said aloud that has already been understood, and needs only to be spoken to become real. Miss Marple did not begin with the gloves. She began with 1942, and a composition submitted to the Sandbourne Pier Pavilion Orchestra under the name of its conductor, and 11 seasons of programs crediting the same name for the same body of work. She named the specific works, not just the Harbour Suite, but the preceding decade of compositions, the Sea Variations, the Esplanade Suite, the Winter Concerts pieces, each one built from Constance Vane's musical vocabulary by Constance Vane, and performed as Leonard Ashby's. She named the stipend, £4 a week, paid privately, which amounted over 11 years to approximately £2,200. And she named the Decca recording, sold 3 months prior, for £200, to which Constance had contributed every note, and from which she had received nothing, and of which she had been informed, not by Ashby, but by a gramophone record arriving in the post from a former college friend, who had bought it and wondered if she'd heard it. She said all of this matter-of-factly, as one states what is established. Then she said, the baton, the cork grip, the aconitine solution, which a person with a chemistry background and a dedicated purpose could prepare from a plant available in any garden. The rubber gloves, which absorbed trace amounts in handling and were then placed in a cloth parcel and carried down from the stage in an instrument case and locked in a locker. She said all of this also, in the same tone. Then she stopped and looked at Constance Vane across the table. Constance's composure had held through the inventory. It was very well-constructed composure, the kind that has been tested many times and has learned its own limits. It held through the naming of the compositions, and through the naming of the baton, and through the naming of the gloves. It did not hold through the harbor theme. "Tell me what the tune means to you," Miss Marple said. "Not for the record. Quietly. I know something of where it comes from. I'd like to hear it in your words." The composure broke the way a very carefully maintained thing breaks, when the pressure applied to it reaches the exact point that the structure was never quite designed to withstand. Not explosively, but precisely, along the line that had been accumulating stress the longest. "He never asked," Constance said. She said it in the tone of a woman describing something that has been true for 11 years, and has the weight of all 11 years behind it. "He never once asked what any of it meant. Not the harbor theme, not the sea variations, not any of it. He simply assumed it was available to him, that if it came from me, it was his. The recording, when the record arrived in the post, and I heard it playing, my father's tune, with his name on the label." She stopped. Her hands moved on the table. "I'd known for a long time that it was wrong. I'd told myself that telling myself was enough. And then I heard my father's tune on a gramophone record with someone else's name on it, and I understood that it was never going to be enough. And I had waited too long to be able to change it by any means that he would have accepted. Inspector Godwin said the necessary things. Constance listened to them with the steadiness of a woman who has known they were coming, and has made her peace with the fact. And when he went to make the telephone call, she sat quietly, with her hands on the table, and looked at the August sky through the window, which was very blue and entirely indifferent to what was happening in the room below it. Miss Marple sat with her for a moment, before leaving. She did not say anything that seemed adequate, because there was nothing adequate to say. What had been done to Constance Vane over 11 years was real and sustained and wrong. And what Constance had done in response was also wrong. And the two wrongs did not cancel each other. And sitting with the complexity of that, without trying to simplify it, was the only honest thing available to either of them. She said good afternoon and left. Chapter 13. Coda. The silence after. Mrs. Beach was knitting when Miss Marple returned to the Anchor guest house that evening. She looked up and asked, in the direct way of a woman who has known someone long enough to dispense with social approach, how it had ended. "It has ended," Miss Marple said. She sat down. They were quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the pier was dark. The concert hall closed, its white-painted exterior pale and still against the evening sky. The sea moved at the end of the pier, with its usual indifference to the events of the week. "I always thought," Mrs. Beach said slowly, "there was something different about the way she listened to the music. Not the way one listens to someone else's work. More as though it were internal. As though she were listening to something she was remembering." She paused. "I thought it was a particularly musical way of attending. I didn't think it meant what it apparently meant." "No," Miss Marple said, "one doesn't usually." She thought about that, about the way that the true explanation of a thing, once found, seems to have been obviously available all along, and about how this impression is misleading. It had not been obvious. It had required following the music to where it came from, which required knowing that it came from somewhere specific, which required hearing the harbor theme with enough attention to wonder why it had the quality of a folk memory, and not of a composed piece, the quality of something found rather than made, transcribed rather than invented. She had heard it on Wednesday evening, and something in it had lodged and not released, in the way that things lodge when they are true. "The suite will still be on the Decca record," Mrs. Beach said. "People will still listen to it and think it's his." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "though I imagine when the full story becomes known, things may be reconsidered. The record companies and the courts have ways of addressing these things, given sufficient evidence and sufficient will." She thought of the handwritten draft Trice had seen, the stipend records Godwin would now be tracing, the college composition portfolio. There is, I believe, enough evidence. It will take time. These things do. And will she be able to? Mrs. Beach stopped, unsure how to complete the question. "I don't know," Miss Marple said honestly. "That is for other people to determine, in other rooms, and it will take longer than this week." She looked out at the dark pier. "But the music is what it is, regardless of what name has been on the label. What is true about it has always been true. The recording doesn't change what it is. Nothing he did changed what it was." She thought of the harbor theme, of the fact that it was real before it was anything else. A man on a Cornish quayside before dawn, going to his boat, humming something he had perhaps received from his own father. His daughter, 9 years old, writing it down with the instinct of someone who understands that what is hummed in the morning before light is the truest thing a person carries. The music built from that memory, the suite that had played in this hall for 11 seasons, and was now on a gramophone record in shops across the country, carried that truth inside it. Audiences had felt it without knowing what they were feeling. The specific authenticity of a thing built from a real place and a real person and a real morning. No name on a contract changes what a thing actually is. This is both the most consoling and the most complicated aspect of the whole business. And Miss Marple sat with it, as she sat with most things that were both true and not simple, without trying to resolve the complication. Mrs. Beach set down her knitting after a while. "I won't renew my season ticket," she said. "I don't think I could hear the suite again without it would be different now. Even if it ends up being hers in the records, officially. The hall and the memory of it." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "It would be." The pier stood in the water with its lights off, a long, pale shape against the dark. The sea moved around it. The evening settled into night, and Sandbourne-on-Sea continued, as it always had, to be exactly the right size. And there you have it. 11 years of music, one recording that went too far, and a woman who had agreed to be invisible for so long that when she finally refused, she had only one refusal left. I've been thinking about the question I asked at the start, about work that someone else received the credit for, and whether you said something or stayed silent. I think what Constance's story shows, and this is not a defense of what she did, is that silence has a weight that accumulates. Each year she said nothing. The saying something became a larger and more impossible act, until it was no longer possible. And then she did the only thing that felt available. That is not an excuse. It is, I think, a warning. If you left a thought in the comments already, thank you. If you haven't, this is the story for that thought. And if Midnight Pages is the place you come when you want a story that takes its time and takes credit seriously, I'm very glad it is. Subscribe if you haven't, and the next story will come to you. This is David. Good night from Ohio. May what you create bear your name, and may you never have to choose between silence and everything else.